recording it. Okay, thank you for being here to our GSSI webinar series, Research Doesn't Stop. Today we are very pleased to have with us Professor Kendra Strauss from Simon Fraser University, Canada, who will talk of a very interesting and timely topic. The title is Just Recovery or Care Economy, Feminist Economy, Geography and Care After COVID. So a special welcome to Professor Kendra Strauss, and thank you for being here and for waking up so early. So let me now introduce very briefly Professor Kendra Strauss before giving the floor to her. She is Associate Professor at Simon Fraser University, Canada, and Director of the Labor Studies Program and the Morgan Center for Labor Research. She is a geographer and feminist political economist with teaching and research interests in the areas of labor and regulation, social reproduction, migration, urbanization, and the political ecology of social infrastructures. Her research has mostly focused on pension politics and financialization, precarity and unfreedom in contemporary labor markets, geographical imaginations of environmental change and labor and urbanization. She is also editor of Human Geography of the Annals of the American Association of Geographers. I'm sure I have missed something, but we have time also after the presentation to get to know her. Before leaving the floor to Professor Kendra Strauss, let me outline the structure and organization of this webinar. The webinar is split into two parts. First, we will listen to Kendra's talk for about 1 hour. After that, we will have the questions and answers session for the remaining time. So please raise your virtual hand to ask me to take the floor to make your question. And please keep the questions for the second part of the webinar unless you have to ask something which is not clear in that moment of the presentation. Also, people following us on YouTube can ask questions. And speaking of this, let me thank in advance my colleague Martina Dalmolin from GSSI, who will collect questions from YouTube for me. And for those who are attending the Zoom session, this session, I must inform you for privacy issues that the webinar is recorded. So if you have any issue with that, I kindly ask you to move to YouTube and follow the streaming of the webinar. That's all, I think. So, Kendra, the floor is yours, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Julia, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to you and Sandro and others who've organized this. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to connect with all of you virtually. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, and I'm also going to read my presentation today just to help me keep to time. So as I mentioned, just before I start sharing my screen, I just want to start by thanking the organizers of the Research Doesn't Stop Social Sciences webinar series for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure, in this age of, without being able to travel, to be able to connect with people, when we can't attend conferences. So I join you today from the unceded and stolen lands of the Lekwungen-speaking people, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, also called Victoria, British Columbia in Canada. As many of you may have heard or read, this acknowledgement of my positionality as an uninvited guest on these lands comes at a moment when many Canadian settlers are grappling with the discovery of 215 unmarked graves of Indigenous children on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which is about an 8-hour drive from where I live. A heartrending confirmation of what Indigenous communities across Turtle Island have long known, that the true number of children killed by the Canadian state's genocidal system remains unknown. So this context, along with many others in our current moment, so from the mainstream resurgence of ultranationalist, fascist, and supremacist politics to the multi-scalar inequities of the pandemic and its impacts, frames the question of how we understand feminist economic geography, its contributions, and its continued evolution as a knowledge project in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic and the futures that we might want to imagine. So this talk in part builds on recent research and a recent project that I'll talk about in a moment, but also the ways in which the pandemic has kind of forced me to think about myself as a feminist economic geographer and the work that I do. So, as I wrote in the abstract for this talk, feminist economic and labor geographers have long engaged with feminist economics and feminist political economy as fields that offer frameworks that can be spatialized to ground critical analyses of capitalism and the production of social difference. From economic decision making to labor market change to financialization, these approaches have gendered geographical political economy and spotlighted its gaps and silences. My own research, starting with my work as a graduate student on economic decision making in pensions and how we study it, and later on feminist labor geographies, has also attempted these kinds of interventions. And the COVID-19 pandemic has further demonstrated what many feminist economic and labor geographers have long argued, including me in some of my work, that feminized and racialized labor, especially care labor, is essential work that is invisibilized and devalued in both the public and the private spheres, and at the same time often ignored in mainstream economic geography. So I'm just going to share my screen now. I have a few slides just to go along with my presentation. Okay, can everyone see that? Great. So in what follows, I draw on two recent papers, one focusing on the restructuring of seniors care in BC, Canada, that comes at the end of a project called Workers in the Aging City, Elder Care Markets in Vancouver and Shanghai that I've been working on with my colleague Feng Xu at the University of Victoria for about the last 5 or 6 years. And also on a recent book chapter where I was reflecting on the role of the concepts of care and social reproduction in feminist geography. And drawing on these two papers, I consider the role of the social sciences, especially feminist economic geography and feminist political economy, in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic as the latest conjunctural crisis to spotlight uneven geographical development and its attendant sociospatial relations. So I'm going to first just briefly turn to sort of the place of social reproduction and care labor in feminist economic geography, and some of the what we might think of as maybe some gaps or silences in those approaches as frameworks through which many of us address this and related crises. And then draw on some recent empirical research on the restructuring of seniors care in Canada to demonstrate what a feminist political economy analysis, I argue, can add to a growing body of work in geography on economic rents and rent relations. And in this work, I try to highlight what our economic geography analyses might miss when they otherwise largely ignore the role of both labor and social reproduction in the processes that we sometimes think of as financialization. I also, however, and this is how I'll conclude the presentation, pose some questions about the possible limitations in our moment of feminist political economy, especially as it's practiced in the academy, and feminist economic and labor geographies for grappling with the really complex politics of post COVID-19 economies and geographies. So, like many other middle class white workers in Canada, my partner and I have kept our jobs, our incomes, and our health, if not always our sanity, especially when our three children were at home with us during the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting sociospatial reorganization of labor. The crisis of care, as it is being called, has touched us to the extent that, like other home based workers, the delineations of home, work, and leisure have all but been erased in the last 12 months. So, as Daniel Cockayne writes in a recent paper, the pandemic induced increase in working from home stands to radically transform, both rhetorically and materially, the respective meanings of work and home, their roles in everyday life, and their roles in the capitalist economic structures to which we remain subject. And yet, of course, this transformation, despite its broad and very real implications, is highly uneven. Almost half of Canadian workers cannot do their jobs from home, and many have not remained employed. Many of these are, in fact, frontline and essential workers in sectors like health, social care, retail, so grocery, liquor sales, transport, warehousing, food processing, education, and childcare, the sectors that are essential to our individual and collective reproduction, and which in Canada also employ the largest number of workers. So in 2020, wholesale and retail trade, followed by healthcare, social assistance, and retail, were the top three sectors by employment in Canada. And yet they are often the sectors that remain least examined, for example, in our field of economic geography. In BC, like in other parts of Canada and beyond, those who have not remained employed are disproportionately racialized, low income, and young. The highest layoff rates have been in the lowest two wage deciles. The unemployment rate among young workers remains more than double that of workers 25 and over. Indigenous workers face worse health outcomes than non Indigenous workers, and all Indigenous and visible minority groups report higher unemployment and higher levels of financial stress than white households. So, like in Canada, like in the US, Canada has really seen this as a crisis that highlights racialized as well as gender and class inequalities. There is increasingly evidence of what pundits in Canada love to call a she-cession. That is, women's unemployment is higher than men's, unlike in previous recessions. And that's unsurprising given the sectoral impacts of the pandemic, increased care and domestic responsibilities that have accompanied school and childcare closures, and the horrendous spread of COVID-19 in the seniors care sector in particular. And it's interesting that in Canada, the she session, as they're calling it, has received more policy attention, and in particular, some commitments from our federal government to a comprehensive national childcare strategy, which Canada currently lacks. But attention to the, for example, racialized context of the pandemic impacts has been much less forthcoming. So, this moment of increased visibility of multiple crises of care spotlights a broader crisis of social reproduction, which Rao argued in a recent paper in the Global Labor Journal is clearly nothing new. What we might call the crisis tendencies of social production under capitalism. In doing so, it begs the question, what does feminist economic geography contribute to understandings of these crisis tendencies? So what in particular do we have to offer in this moment? And in what ways does social reproduction in particular help develop those understandings, and what might be its limitations? And I ask this question in part both as someone who has used and developed concepts of social reproduction in my own work, but as I'll touch on in a moment, we're in an interesting moment in the social sciences where social reproduction is actually an increasingly common framework, and I'm going to mention this again in a moment. So I became interested in the relationship between paid and unpaid labor and their value and distribution in capitalist market economies as a PhD student exploring the dynamics and impacts of privatization in occupational workplace pensions. So it became very clear to me at that time that many of the inequities, for example, in pension access, come about because of the differential attachment to paid labor between men and women. The origins, and so I turned to social reproduction theory as a way of exploring these differences, and in particular their politics. The origins of social reproduction theory, which many in this audience will know well because of the work of really important Italian theorists in this area, are now relatively well documented in geography. So we have the work of people like Cindy Katz, who over many years has really expanded the use and vocabulary of social reproduction in geography. And so for those who aren't familiar, emerging from activist feminist engagements with Marx's theorization of the wage relation in capitalism, and in particular the lack of attention to domestic labor, in particular, the concepts of social reproduction and social production were really central to a feminist articulation of class struggle that sort of emerged in and through activist feminist struggles in the 1960s and 1970s. So, as the Transnational Coalition of the Power of Women and Subversion of Community wrote, the specific social relation, which is capital then, is the wage relation. And the wage relation can exist only when the ability to work becomes a saleable commodity. Marx calls this commodity labor power. To describe its basic production and reproduction is to describe women's work. And that's a quote from James and Della Costa. Maria Mies has also argued for this analysis of social reproduction to include the general production of life or subsistence production, mainly performed by the non-wage labor of women and other non-wage laborers such as slaves, contract workers, and peasants in the colonies in her exploration of the new international division of labor. So, interestingly, despite the transnational and multiracial coalition building that undergirded movements like the Wages Against Housework movement, the location of women's oppression and exploitation, specifically in unpaid domestic work in the male breadwinner household, had the effect over time, especially, of somewhat eliding or downplaying differences among women. So while James and others argued for a class gender analysis, rejecting on the one hand class subordinated to feminism and on the other feminism subordinated to class, what Angela Davis has called the triple jeopardy of women, race, and class had really already been theorized and analyzed, including by Black feminist, socialist, and communist intellectuals like Claudia Jones, who worked first in the United States and then in the UK. In her 1949 pamphlet, Jones cogently sets out the ways in which Black women had the responsibility of caring for the needs of family, of militantly shielding it from the blows of Jim Crow insults, of rearing children in an atmosphere of lynch terror, segregation, and police brutality, and of fighting for the education for the children. So, words that very much still ring true in our present moment. And Jones, was someone who was active in the Communist Party of the US in the post-World War II period, and a very active and militant Marxist-Leninist activist and theorist. Jones also pointed out that Black women were far more likely, like many working class women, to actually engage in wage labor and to be the main breadwinners in the case of Black women or heads of households than white women. Moreover, Jones was clear that Black women in the US were forced into paid domestic work by racism and discrimination, and that they were largely failed, and she was very clear on this, by a white male labor movement uninterested in organizing domestic workers, and that Black women's struggles and leadership were consistently undermined by manifestations of white chauvinism and paternalism among white progressives. So again, words that seem very current in their analysis. In other words, she vigorously asserted the ways that the women's movement and radical revolutionary politics had to understand Black women's experiences at the intersection of race, class, and gender as the vital link to this heightened political consciousness that would contribute to the entire American working class. Far from suggesting that intersectional politics subordinate class or reinscribe rigid categories of identity, Jones' analysis situated intersectional experiences as a locus of radical transformation of class, and thus capital as a social relation, without losing the historical and contemporary specificity of Black women's experience both within the US and in transnational and diasporic contexts. And Carol Boyce Davies has a wonderful book on Jones' work from which a lot of my analysis is drawn and is very dependent on. But this is one reason, as I said, her writing rings so true today. She was also explicit about the ways that racial terror, police violence, white supremacy, and discrimination in the labor market problematize universalizing claims about gender, the family, the household, and the sexual division of labor. And yet, Joyce's theoretical and analytical insights are largely invisible in social reproduction politics and theory, including within academic feminist political economy. So these various standpoints of critique from which social reproduction theory emerged and their relationship with different liberation struggles were transmuted by social reproduction's institutionalization as feminist analysis slowly made inroads in academic social sciences. From a politics of refusal, so James wrote, with Dalla Costa, the movement poses by its very existence and must pose with increasing articulation in action that women refuse the myth of liberation through work. Social reproduction theory developed as a framework instead for feminist political economists to analyze structures, relations, and struggles over production and reproduction. And of course, in some articulations, feminist political economy in particular became a framework for advocating for and defending women's participation in wage work and rights in the workplace, which is clearly important work, but somewhat different from the idea that wage work is a locus of resistance. So the concept of social reproduction was also broadened to encompass, on one hand, the institutional and material infrastructures of the welfare state that support the reproduction of both labor power and class relations, and on the other, the broader forms of unpaid work within and beyond the household that sustain communities. So these approaches were very much taken up by heterodox political economists in geography. Jamie Peck, writing in 1996, wrote that reproducing people involves an enormous variety of processes, from biological procreation to media consumption, from education and training to clothing and caring, which tend to be anchored not only in the market, but in the household, community, and state. Cindy Katz, writing in 2001, identified political economic, cultural, and environmental aspects of social reproduction, echoing the work of scholars like Antonella Picchio and Mies to explicitly argue for the material grounds of reproduction, including its environmental aspect, which Nancy Fraser has also recently written about. So, this evolution in approaches to social reproduction coincided with an increased interest in care and care work among feminist theorists, attention to feminization of transnational migration as a way of addressing care deficits, and research on the impacts of structural adjustment policies, welfare state retrenchment, and privatization. In economic geography, however, the interest in social reproduction among heterodox scholars of labor markets and production regimes actually waned somewhat after the sort of late 1990s. And I remember as a graduate student, for example, organizing sessions on social reproduction at the Royal Geographical Conference in London in the sort of early 2000s, and there being a very small handful of us in the room talking about these approaches. At the same time, the concept of social reproduction has very interestingly gained sort of mainstream popularity in the social sciences, especially after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And this diagram represents, I just did some work recently to do some searches on engines like Web of Science to try and get a sense of where work on social reproduction is actually coming from within the academy. And we'll see, you can see here from this image that the number of papers with social reproduction in the topic by discipline between 1900 and 2021, most of which have been in the last 15 years, sociology is actually the dominant discipline, but geography is second. And so geographers have really started to write, in particular in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, explicitly about social reproduction. But while the majority of papers in this database, for example, or that show up in these kinds of searches are actually in geography journals, Antipode being one of the key journals, very few of these papers appear in the main economic geography journals. There have been 2 papers in economic geography by Diane Perrins and Jamie Peck that explicitly use social reproduction or have it as a topic, and only 1 in the Journal of Economic Geography by Al James and Bhaskar Vira. So these are obviously rough metrics, but they suggest that while an increasing number of geographers are using social reproduction in their analyses, this research, including when published by economic and labor geographers, still falls rather outside of the core of economic geography. And there have been a number of papers written recently kind of reflecting on economic geography as a discipline, where it's going, where economic geographers are situated, and sort of what counts as economic geography in the context of what Trevor Barnes and others have called engaged pluralism. But as Emily Rosenman and her co-authors have recently written, despite feminist economic geographers' success at identifying the fundamental relationships between such processes as economic production and social reproduction, economic geographical research on women, categories of social difference, and non-traditional and informal employment relationships are still largely framed as outside stalwart disciplinary traditions like industrial restructuring. This is despite more than 25 years of feminist economic geographers' rigorous evidence showing how dominant approaches to economic restructuring explain the transition of only a narrow portion of the economy in a small number of places. And for example, research on precarious employment is a good example of this. In my role as somebody in a labor studies program, I attend a lot of conferences and events with scholars of precarity and precarious employment. Some in geography, many outside of geography, but very few economic geographers in particular working on these topics explicitly. And I can kind of attest to this in an interesting way now as my role as an editor of the Annals. where I see sort of the range of papers that come across the human geography desk, the vast majority of papers submitted on economic restructuring, financialization, global production networks, or regional studies still very much focus on industrial production or increasingly on the financial sector. And this is despite the ways that the COVID-19 pandemic, when it was declared in early 2020, suddenly really shone a spotlight on just how how insufficient theories of crisis and restructuring are when they focus only on a narrow portion of the economy in a small number of places. So I'm going to turn now to talk a little bit about some of the recent work that I've done on restructuring in the seniors care sector. If crisis is inherent to globalized capitalism, feminists have argued for decades that these crisis tendencies manifest in material and interrelated, if distinct ways, in the domains of social reproduction and production. The increase in academic publications on the topic of social reproduction reflect the more widespread recognition of this interrelationship. But even as it has failed to fundamentally shift the core topical and theoretical orientations of economic geography, the COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned, has kind of pulled back the curtain on capitalism's hidden abodes, as Fraser calls them after Marx, exposing frayed social safety nets picked apart by privatization, retrenchment, and structural adjustment, the fragile livelihoods of precarious workers, the degradation of social infrastructures, and across all of these domains, capital's intensified depredations on the already highly uneven terrain of social production. In other words, the processes that have been the focus of much research in economic geography, the geographical restructuring of production, the evolution of global production networks and global value chains, financialization, the rise and fall of regions in the context of new spatial divisions of labor, have been accompanied by equally significant and interrelated changes in the socio-spatial configurations of social production and reproduction, the implications of which COVID-19 has really made visible for all to see. Seniors care, I argue, is one such area in which various crises have failed to sustain mainstream attention, including from economic geographers, despite being an arena in which many of the processes of interest in our field have played out. As Silvia Federici has argued, debates about how older people should be cared for, by whom, and where have largely been framed in mainstream policy discourses in relation to alarmist predictions about the costs of demographic aging that pit younger and older generations against one another in a struggle over scarce resources. She also argues that they are almost entirely absent from what she calls the literature of the radical left. At the same time, while feminist economists and feminist geographers have analyzed labor, care, privatization, and financialization, and new spaces and scales of service provision in seniors' care, these analyses have rather seldom registered in broader debates about geographical political economy. So seniors' care remains a sort of ghettoized sector or area for research. So when Fung and I started our comparative project on seniors care labor markets, looking at and contrasting to what we call least likely or less likely case studies, Vancouver in Canada and Shanghai in China, in 2016, we had a number of research questions. How does the evolution of care regimes relate to changing norms of wage labor, unpaid work, and family and state responsibility? How are elder care labor markets created, and who is channeled into paid elder care labor and under what conditions? And as many of us in Canada, and I'm sure from what I know of Italy too, this is increasingly immigrant and migrant workers in particular. In what ways do financialization and urbanization shape the organization of elder care infrastructures? How do divisions between the public and private sectors and public and private spaces manifest, and when are they blurred or disrupted? So, over the last 5 years, we've conducted interviews and focus groups with residential and home care workers, managers and policymakers, service providers and advocates. We've analyzed policy and legislative changes, examined primary and secondary data where they existed. And in particular with COVID, we really had to pivot to try and make the most of primary and secondary data sources. So for example, statistics from various levels of government, policy documents, both because of COVID-19 and also because of the increasing difficulty of conducting research in China by Canadians because of deteriorating relationships between Canada and China. And that was before travel was no longer possible. So now at the end of this project, the reality is that none of the terrible impacts of COVID-19 on patients and workers in long-term care in Canada came as a surprise. And I'm going to talk explicitly about Canada, but I'm also very happy in questions to say more about the research that we've done in China. The impacts in BC are the result of a 2 decades long process of marketization, privatization, and contracting out, also documented in other contexts in excellent research, for example, by geographies such as Amy Horton in the UK and Kim England and Caitlin Henry in the US. More recently, these processes have been analyzed and associated with processes of financialization as well as privatization. Yet specific mechanisms of contracting out, and these mechanisms were not ones that we expected to pay attention to when we embarked on the project, also came to us to really highlight the role of rentierism in the restructuring of the sector at a time when there happens to be a growing interest in economic rents and rent relations across different subfields of human geography. So in other words, the sort of salience of rent theory to this particular case study was not one we looked for or expected. And the paper that I wrote recently that's just come out in Environment and Planning A, which is an open access paper if anyone is interested, I was actually invited to submit a paper for a special issue on rents, looking at social reproduction, having not really written anything in this area before, but sort of convinced that there was something valuable to say about the specific relations of contracting in this sector that financialization itself just didn't quite explain. So as I argue in this paper, these kind of contributions in rent theory, in geography, and in other disciplines relatively seldom engage with paid or unpaid labor, and also relatively seldom explicitly explore social reproduction, despite the growth and deepening of rent relations in the domain of social reproduction, including elder care. So this has been a real social care and welfare, the welfare sectors more broadly, have been a domain in which these relations of contracting out have been particularly apparent. So I'm just going to say something very briefly about seniors care or elder care because it's not necessarily an area that people know a lot about. And then I'll say something about the specific dynamics that you see on this slide that we saw in BC in the restructuring of seniors care in the last 15 years. And I think I have about just over 15 minutes left, so I'll try and wrap things up after that. So elder care, as many people would know or guess, has traditionally been the responsibility of the family, often though not exclusively women and girls. It's part of social reproduction, but unlike childcare or domestic tasks that reproduce labor power, it is deemed, as Federici argues, to absorb value, not produce it, at least in many Western societies. When this labor is waged, the jobs are highly feminized, and in Canada, as in other places, highly racialized. In BC, it is older migrant and immigrant women, most of them over the age of 40, who are overrepresented in the sector. which makes the increasing use of non-professional staff, so care aides, home and community support workers, in-home carers, rather than, for example, professional nurses, to keep labor costs down, a particularly kind of important process in this sector. Defamilialized care has always been delivered in BC by a mix. So, sorry, BC is the province or the region of Canada that I live in, by a mix of state, for-profit, and nonprofit providers, as well as by the family. With the expansion of state-funded and not-for-profit care expanding in the post-war period up to about the late 1990s, and then a sharp reversal of this expansion in the last 15 years. So, in other words, the last 15 years since the late 1990s has, as the first bullet point on this slide noted, seen a reversal in the provision from predominantly public and not-for-profit care to the largest number of beds in, for example, nursing homes or long-term care homes now being provided by for-profit operators. Our interviews with workers in Vancouver really highlighted what they themselves understand as the persistent devaluation of their labor as an active and explicit policy of government between the early 2000s and 2016. And this has taken a variety of forms, well documented in research by academics and by activists and advocacy groups in British Columbia. So, as this slide points out, legislative and policy changes stripped no contracting out clauses from the collective agreements of unionized workers, enacted wage rollbacks and benefit cuts, and encouraged health authorities to shed unionized jobs and cut costs through the privatization of services. So, this is all the context that led us to the point at which the seniors care sector in BC was facing the COVID-19 pandemic when it hit. And it hit hard and early in seniors care facilities and nursing homes in British Columbia, as in many other places. As a result of these changes, detailed on this slide, the role of for-profit operators, some of them local companies, some of them international health corporations, but also insurance and financial companies, providing services funded by taxpayer dollars, expanded across the sector. And these operators, through legislation, became exempt from sectoral wage setting mechanisms that applied to public health authorities. And I'll talk in a minute just briefly about how that happened and what the implications were for wages. Pay, benefits, and job quality declined, but precaritization went deeper. Hours were cut, on-call and just-in-time scheduling increased, and workers talked in interviews about insidious work intensification, relentless cost cutting, including reusing and rationing essential supplies in for-profit settings, an issue that would surface again in relation to personal protective equipment during the pandemic. These processes were exacerbated by persistent understaffing in the sector with high rates of occupational injury. Workers spoke of a labor process organized and resourced in ways that made the delivery of quality care impossible, though that was their words. We came to think about elder care labor itself through this research in Canada and in China as a vital social infrastructure that had been subject to privatization, disinvestment, devaluation, and new management regimes that actively undermined its vital social role. As I mentioned, these processes, this devaluation of labor was achieved largely through the mechanism of contracting out. Contracting out is the outcome of the marketization of care and in turn spurred privatization and the growth of financialized business models, in particular a leaseback model where complex corporate structures separate underlying property assets from the everyday operation of the nursing home or long-term care facility. So these were some of the reasons that rent theory seemed increasingly relevant and opposite to this particular case study. The assetization of land and related social infrastructures has been vital to the realization of profits in this sector, and so too are the contract relations and associated revenue streams derived from general taxation that fund the provision of care. So there are a variety of ways that we can understand this restructuring, and in a sense, they're all correct. There was some straightforward union busting because the healthcare unions in this sector were quite powerful and activist. Privatization, marketization, financialization, and precaritization. But it is both the importance of the locking in of revenue streams and the assetization of landed property that support the value of rent theory to help understand the financialization of capitalism and urban infrastructures broadly, and, as I argue in this paper, the financialization of health and social care in particular. At the same time, I follow Amy Horton in arguing that labor remains vital to understanding how profits are generated, countering claims that financial activities have substantially displaced labor in the creation of value. So I'm just going to sort of briefly run through some of the arguments in the paper. Again, I'm happy to answer questions in the discussion because I won't really have time to go into all the nuances of the argument. But in the paper, I argue that theorists of rent have largely actually ignored both labor and social reproduction, despite how arguments for the growing importance of rentiership and rentierization rest on the expansion and subsequent embedding of rent relations across increasingly broad swathes of economy and society. And I should say, and I cite in the paper, some really important work sort of in urban theory and urban geography, working with land rent frameworks that do touch more on labor and the restructuring of kind of social relations. But some of the more recent work on economic rents has been much less explicit in those types of engagements. Feminist political economy analyses of social reproduction, care work, and the devaluation of feminized and racialized labor, I argue in the paper, can thus enrich approaches to rent that might otherwise miss the salience of labor to emerging social relations. So in the paper, I build on sort of recent summaries and sort of papers that have advocated for broader uses of rent theory within geography. Callum Ward and Manuel Albers argue, for example, that critical land rent theory starts from an examination of how landed property rights command large values, the largest portion of which cannot be attributed to labor or interest on capital investments, but seemingly appears from nothing. So, rent theory is partly about explaining how these profits appear. Renewed interest in land rent theory relates to trends in urbanization and financialization, but the role and importance of sectors like IT, digital services, and biotechnology, and the commodification and financialization of nature have also spurred an interest in emerging and evolving forms of economic rents. Because of these trends, and as recent commentaries in geography and urban studies have pointed out, critical rent theory has emerged from a period of relative neglect in kind of mainstream critical and radical political economy. And from the expanded discussion of forms of economic rent has emerged a sort of general theory of what's been called rentierization, which addresses the increasing centrality of what Brett Christophers calls the increased centrality of income derived from possession or control of scarce assets under conditions of limited or no competition. And this is a definition that he explicitly explores in relation to contracting out. So Anne Heila's work in 1990 raised three main questions on land rent that can also be applied to types of economic rent. assets associated with intellectual property rights, for example. How does rent emerge? Who or what are its agents, and what is its economic role? So if the theorization of forms of economic rent and the general rent framework seem to seek to capture the growing centrality of assetization, as Kian Birch has called it, and the generation of putative future income streams, as Ward and Swingadow have argued, across and within a range of capitalist sectors in contemporary economies, a shift to asset-based societies in which previously wage-led growth regimes have reoriented around profit and investment for capital has expanded reproduction dependent on the capture of and leveraging against new income streams. This shift is implicated both in the tendency of landowners to treat property as a pure financial asset and in the tendency of different fractions of capital to seek opportunities for capturing economic rents. And this is exactly what we've seen with the privatization of seniors' care in BC. Thus, as Christophers argues, much of what has been characterized as financialization is also a deepening of rent relations through mechanisms of assetization. However, while the shift to asset-based societies described by Ward and Swingadow does entail a shift away from wage-led growth regimes, what I think the seniors care sector shows is that labor does not lose its importance in relation to the way that value is generated or the way that profits are generated and captured in the sector. And in the paper, to make this argument, and I'll just very briefly touch on this, I draw on some arguments that Stephen Katz made in a 1986 review of Harvey's Limits to Capital that pointed to the occlusion of labor in Harvey's analysis. And I argue in the paper that if we follow Katz in arguing for the salience of labor to land rent theory and apply his broad insights to economic and other forms of rent, it becomes apparent that analyses of rentierization or rentierism are incomplete without examining struggles over labor and wages. Moreover, the seeming assetization of everything, or what Andreucci et al. Have called value grabbing, which seeks to extend rent relations into all domains of life, relies on transformations of the role of the state, capital-labor relations, and norms and relations and institutions of social reproduction. So I draw on the work of Isabel Bakker and Stephen Gill, who call these economic and societal changes the reprivatization of social reproduction. And they draw on Gramsci to link these to wider conditions of primitive or original accumulation. So the reprivatization of social reproduction in their account includes the privatization of state assets and parts of the state itself, and the alienation or enclosure of common forms of property. And that includes social infrastructures such as schools, hospitals, public housing, or in the case study that I'm looking at, seniors' care and seniors' care facilities. It also includes the privatization of previously socialized institutions of social reproduction, like public seniors' care, which encompasses both the creation of markets for profit care and the devolution of responsibilities for care back onto the household. So these two processes happen in tandem. Reprivatization historicizes these processes, reminding us that the socialization and decommodification of care are the outcome of historically contingent social struggles and norms. And this is an argument that's been made very powerfully by Antonella Picchio in her historical analyses of social reproduction. The mechanisms of dispossession described by Bakker and Gill are also theorized by Harvey as accumulation by dispossession, which rent theorists have used to explore, for example, socio-ecological struggles over the establishment of property rights and regimes. So work on value grabbing, for example, argues that accumulation by dispossession signals the continuous character of capitalism's enclosures that enforces the separation of people from their social means of reproduction while permitting their enrollment as classes of labor in the production of value. So what I sort of discuss in the paper is that accumulation by dispossession is useful because it signals the historically specific ways that common rights and entitlements, the product of working class struggles, are transformed into property rights mobilized to extract value through rent relations. And in the case of workers in seniors care, we can see this explicitly not only through the devaluation of their work and through wage cuts, but through things like the removal of rights to pensions and access to pensions or extended health care benefits. So this involves three processes: dispossession and devaluation of labor, assetization, and the rationing of public supports for social reproduction. And although I don't have time to go into it now, one of the things that's happened alongside these processes of privatization and contracting out is actual reductions in public funding for seniors care and the rationing of care, meaning that fewer people are eligible for publicly funded care. The latter shapes norms of social reproduction and lays the groundwork for the social production of rent relations, as well as the production of precarious work relations. These processes are interrelated and interdependent. And as we can see in the case of the restructuring of elder care in BC, the devaluation of labor occurs through particular market-making activities of the state, as well as through the activities of private capital. Oh, sorry, my slides aren't advancing here. And so what we see, you know, if we sort of build on this idea of accumulation by dispossession, are specific ways in which the funding model associated with contracting out actively facilitates the appropriation of revenues designated to fund wages. The same model also allows for-profit operators to expense, that is, to use public money for property-related costs for private assets. So seniors care buildings and the land that underpin them, and those assets are often owned by financial or investment firms through complex leaseback models. And so I'm coming to the end of my time, so I'm just going to briefly talk you through this funding model, and I can answer questions if people have them. So essentially what happened in the seniors care sector in BC was that the government implemented, after the process of facilitating contracting out to private companies, a block funding model where wages for care that were paid to the operators, both for profit and not for profit, was based on a wage rate that was set in a collective agreement that was sectoral. However, for profit operators were allowed to opt out of the sectoral wage setting mechanism, which meant that they were essentially able to pocket the difference between the wage level set in the collective agreement and the wage that they actually paid to workers, which in many cases was 28% less than the industry standard wage. For-profit operators were not and are still not required to audit the direct reporting of care hours, so they don't have to account for how many hours of direct care they actually provide. And they can co-locate private pay and publicly subsidized beds, which mean that they can use publicly subsidized beds to provide care to private pay clients. At the same time, and I'm sorry, this is a really big quote, but the highlighted bits of this quote just show the differences in the proportion of property-related expenses that private providers use public revenues to pay for. So 20% of revenues among for-profit operators in the care sector go to building costs. And those buildings are privately owned and remain private assets. So this research has really highlighted, I think, the ways in which the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, including the really shocking implications for the pandemic for seniors care workers and seniors who live in these facilities, um, you know, as I mentioned earlier, were really unsurprising to anyone who's paid attention to the sector over the last 10 years. And just to conclude, one of the findings of the BC case study within our project was the sense not only of fatigue with a lack of attention to the problems of the care regime in BC over the last decade, and the downloading of the social and economic costs of privatization onto workers and care recipients. It was also a sense of fatigue with the lack of a difference that knowing and showing those costs made. In other words, a sense that these are not things that are not known. The problem is they're things that not enough people care about. So I've been thinking a lot about the implications of this for feminist economic geography as a knowledge project and a community of praxis within the broader arena of academic social sciences in relation to our response to the pandemic. One implication is that feminist knowledge production inside the academy is constrained by the institution itself. I mean, this is something we all know, and this is not an original insight. But it reinforces, I think, the need for open and honest discussions about the politics of research that seek to confirm what our research participants already know, as opposed to the politics of co-creating knowledge that actively and explicitly centers their expertise, including in the realms of theory and policy analysis. So, for example, in relation to this EPA paper, one of the questions that I've been asking myself is, what good does this paper do to the workers who dedicated their time to this project? And how does it, or how could it, work to shift some of the politics around seniors care? And of course, the answer is that as an EPA paper, it doesn't do very much. So what are the broader ways that it could be used, or that these data could be used? So just to wrap up, this has also sort of caused me to question somewhat what the role of feminist political economy is as a touchstone of feminist economic geography in this kind of decentering project. And recently, when I was rereading Sex, Race, and Class, Selma James' book, I was reminded in a footnote that she's scathing about the very idea of Marxist political economy. So, following Luxemburg, for example, she states that Marx negated political economy in theory, and the working class negates it in practice. While it's likely to make academics bridle, including people like myself who have called, myself a feminist political economist for a long time, it does matter it poses the question, does it matter whether economic geography incorporates feminist analyses or concepts and frameworks like social reproduction? So as someone who's been arguing for a long time that mainstream economic geography needs to incorporate these frameworks more, does it matter? Is this really the struggle that's the most important? And of course, the answer varies depending on one's social location, career stage, the degree of security one has in the academy, and one's positionality outside of the academy. And so perhaps a more pressing question that I've been asking myself is, does feminist political economy and relatedly social reproduction theory offer a foundation for working towards a more radical politics of care? And I think the answer is possibly, but only if it's understood not as the solution to a singular epistemological or political problem of the neglect of reproductive labor. Rather, we can ask ourselves, if COVID-19 has rendered invisible care work visible, what remains invisible within our own field and our own frameworks? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kendra Strauss, for this very insightful presentation. So as usual, we first leave the floor to students, and then we open up the session to the audience. So if students have any questions or also comments, or they want to ask for some clarifications, this is the time. don't be shy. As usual, they need some time to break the ice in a way. And then we have a question or comment from our postdoc, but I just wait some minutes for students because these webinars are intended for them, of course, before. So any question from you? There's someone who switch on her mic, but I don't know if it's intended or not. Maybe not. So now, in the meantime, I will leave the floor to Adriana Binate, who is a postdoc here at the GSSI. Go ahead, Adriana.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much. It was really not only interesting, but it's opened us to a new world of effectively a field that, as you show us, is not so much care people. Maybe we doesn't have care enough. And me and Julia, together with a team of the United States, we are analyzing for the second wave of questionnaire in Italy and the United States, and we are focused on inequalities, the effect of COVID and health and caregiving, especially on women's. First of all, it's so hard to find women's with kids that are inside this platform because we are already working with prolific science. There's not so much way to arrive to women that we are trying to have found these informations. So my question is more like ask you like some advices in two things. One is, what do you think are some elements from the United States what we should consider it on this? And other is, we want to run a multi-level analysis too. So from a point of view of behavioral economics and geographical economics. So which geographical variables we should include? We of course, we're already going to include case of COVID deaths, but which variable do you think must be included in our geographic analysis and inside with behavioral analysis that consider women? I don't know how to, if I made the right question.
Those are really good questions, and it sounds like a really interesting project. And I have a lot of sympathy because it's a hard time to be doing this research and gathering data and finding participants. And it is a really hard time to understand what the key kind of variables are, and the questions to be asking, especially in a survey format. So for example, we did, so the academic union at SFU and a group called Academic Women, we did a survey of all SFU faculty to try and understand the differential impacts of COVID. And, you know, one of the really difficult elements of this research was, on the one hand, getting people to respond during a time when people feel really overburdened, you know, and there's also research fatigue because, you know, some of the groups who are most impacted are also the groups who are being asked most often about their experiences. And that's a tricky balance to sort of get to. But I think that your second point about, you know, what are the levels of analysis, you know, particularly geographic, I don't know that I have an answer to that. But I think that, you know, if we think back to work in economic geography, if we think back to work, you know, even early work by Susan Hansen and Geraldine Pratt, one of the things that they argued was that it's really important to focus on neighborhood sort of level patterns and interactions, as well as the household and the workplace, to give those equal weight, to understand the differences between women's mobilities and men's mobilities in particular. And so I think one of the questions that we probably don't really know the answer to yet with COVID is, given all of the restrictions that everyone has been under, what have really been the micro level differences in mobilities and in sort of the spatial experiences? You know, who gets an office within the house if there is an office? Who works where if people are working from home? Where are children within the house?
We ask them at that, yes.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've thought of these things, but I think these are some of the elements that we're only starting to understand, and that, you know, a multi-level analysis like yours could really help to start to unpack. And I think it's really interesting that you are looking at, you know, these sort of questions around care responsibilities, but also a kind of, you know, decision-making approach, because I haven't really seen a lot of work that's really brought those two types of frameworks together. And so understanding kind of behaviorally how people understand and frame their choices, I think is going to be really interesting. And, you know, there's a lot of excellent, I mean, the field of behavioral economics has really grown a lot. When I first started, you know, doing some work on behavioral economics in the early 2000s, you know, it was sort of in that first phase of development, and now it's expanded massively. But I think geographers still have a really important kind of spatial lens to add to behavioral economic analyses, which are still often very aspatial. They really don't consider the way that spatial dynamics might shape and influence people's choices and the way that people make decisions. So I don't know that I have any answers for you, but it sounds like a really excellent project. And I think this approach of bringing these different types of analysis together is going to be really fruitful.
Thank you. No, you give us really good advice. Thank you so much.
Yes, this really helps us. So thank you. Very, very good suggestions. Now we have a question from the audience by Zooming. I don't know if he's here. He can also ask the question himself. Zooming, are you here? Would you like to make yourself the question? Otherwise, I'm going to read it. No? Okay, so I'm reading it for you. Thank you. This talk is very interesting. Please read it. He answered. Okay. So this talk is very interesting. Would you please introduce the situation in Shanghai a bit in terms of racialized care labor in both the public and private spheres? I believe the impact of COVID is also different in Shanghai compared to BC.
Yeah, thank you, Zumin. That's a really interesting question, and Feng and I have actually just written a paper for the Canadian Journal Studies in Political Economy, trying to look at the different COVID experiences in Shanghai and in Vancouver, because you're right, they have been very different. And the perception of a sort of crisis in this sector is really non-existent in Shanghai and in China. You know, the sense is that the state, through their very powerful kind of lockdown and control, and in particular the track and tracing, and so that sort of very sort of successful and intensive kind of surveillance of people that has allowed COVID to be tracked and traced has largely kept COVID out of seniors care facilities. But there's also a difference in how seniors care is organized. And so just to answer the first part of your question, the main similarity between BC and or between Vancouver and Shanghai is that the work is very much done by migrants. But of course, in China, it tends to be rural to urban migrants. And in BC, it tends to be either temporary migrant workers who are international or immigrants. So many South Asian and Filipino immigrants in particular. So the migration element is the sort of common denominator there. One of the big differences in Shanghai is that many more workers actually live in. So they provide care in people's homes, or they're even hired within hospital or care settings to spend most of their time in people's rooms. And so what that avoided was the situation in BC where workers are paid such a low wage that they often have to work at more than one facility. And one of the reasons that COVID spread so quickly within seniors care was that workers were working at multiple facilities in order to make a sort of living wage. So it's interesting because, you know, the sector is seen as being is being created almost from scratch by the Chinese state. And municipal governments are very involved in this, but it really hasn't seen the kinds of impacts from COVID that we've seen in Canada. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you also, Zoomin, for your question. Now we have a question from Sara Karamaski, who is a postdoc here at the GSSI.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Kendra, for your insightful presentation. I do have, let's say, a curiosity. I'm curious about the impact of this restructuring of senior care in BC, and so how this de-evaluation of work has been negotiated and contested by the workers themselves. Do you find evidence in your study of strategies or projects about how workers have been enduring these struggles?
Yeah, and
let's say it's a curiosity more than a question.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question and one that I touch on briefly in the paper, but didn't mention in my presentation. So it's a really important one because I don't want to give the impression that workers haven't contested these changes. So when the initial legislative changes were brought in the early and mid 2000s, there were very large strikes and protests. Unfortunately, the government was very successful in making the argument that these workers were overpaid. And it was, I think we can call it an explicitly racist strategy. It focused, so nurses and doctors were excluded from these, you know, wage cuts. So it was all lower paid workers who are disproportionately racialized. And the government came out and said, you know, we can't afford to pay healthcare aides $20 an hour. That's too much for the work that they do. So the government explicitly devalued and made the argument. And as I talk about in the paper, this was done in the context of a sort of explicit discourse, neoliberal discourse of balanced budgets and low taxes. So the argument was, we're going to cut people's taxes, but in order to do so, we need these privileged, overpaid workers to, you know, take a wage cut and be contracted out. So unfortunately, those strikes, although they were very powerful when they happened, they weren't able to sort of sustain the broad-based solidarity that would have been needed to really pressure the government to change course. And there has been really important kind of activist work that's been going on ever since. And one of the things that that I did, one of the reasons I got interested in this project was because I was already involved with a coalition who was supporting the union to try and understand the impacts of these changes. And I've continued to be involved with that coalition. And there's been a lot of work over the years to highlight the conditions and the implications. And it's been so interesting that it's just really hard to get people mobilized around the elderly. And I think the question that I'm interested in our current moment is whether COVID has truly shifted the politics. Is this a moment in which we can make new arguments for a different kind of care that is adequately funded, that is public, and that keeps those assets and social infrastructures as commons? And the answer is I'm not really sure. Because I think there have been commitments to more investments. There's been some contracting in. We have a new government, which helps, which is at least on paper a more centrist left government, but they have not committed to tackle the role of for-profit providers. And so if that isn't addressed, things are not going to change, and that's going to take committed organizing. So that's our task now.
Thank you. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Kendra. Now we have Ugo Rossi. No, sorry. Ugo, maybe you lowered your hand. Do you still want to make a question?
Yes, because, well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thanks, Kendra, for your talk. I want to ask about what do you think about the idea of feminization of politics that is today widely debated in also in urban studies, specifically in so-called municipalism politics. The idea of feminism and feminization of politics against the backdrop also of the politics of care during the pandemic. So what do you think about this idea? So just not being feminized work, but also in terms of more active feminization of politics. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it's not. I know a little bit about those literatures, particularly in relation to kind of municipalism and in urban studies, far less than you. So I'd be interested to hear what you think. But I guess I think, I think that there are very powerful calls. There's a very powerful politics potentially that underlines or that undergirds the ideas of the sort of the feminization of politics, and in particular the politics of care. But one of the arguments I was trying to make by examining, the sort of discourses and histories of social reproduction is, being attentive to what we mean by the feminization of care, and being careful about who is included and who is potentially excluded. And I think one of the challenges in our current moment, both in the, in Europe, but also very much in Canada, is, the sort of politics of solidarity or communalism that underlies a politics of feminization or a politics of care. So what is the role of, for example, migrants or undocumented people in that politics? What role do they have? And what is the understanding of labor? Does our imagination stop with improvements to wage labor? I mean, absolutely, improvements in wage labor are necessary, but I don't actually know if we're going to fundamentally transform relations of care within a sort of social democratic framework. We may see improvements, but we're not going to see a fundamental transformation. And so I think those are the questions where I'm interested to see where these debates are going, and their connection to the politics of organizing on the ground. And in Canada, like in the US, these politics are very connected into the debates that are happening around, anti-racist politics, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous rights. So they also have different kinds of articulations in different places. And that was where, I was sort of in a vague way alluding to a kind of politics of place. I'm not sure that there is a single feminized politics of care. that can apply everywhere. I think these are also grounded local struggles, although potentially with internationalist connections. So I don't know, what do you think? I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating field, that of feminization of politics, especially in terms of critique of sovereign power and some kind of masculinist conceptions of power based on sovereignty. So I think feminization of politics, also in terms of, like Jody Butler puts it in terms of non-violence as kind of tactical non-violence. All these kind of things are very promising avenues in my mind. This kind of feminization of politics is really quite exciting field from my point of view.
Yeah.
Thanks for your answer. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ugo. Now we have a question from Margherita Grazioli from Grand Sasso Science Institute, postdoc. Go ahead, Margherita. Thank you.
Hi, Kendra. Thank you so much for your insightful talk. Actually, you touched on so many different points, and I have tons of questions and comments I'd like to make, but I will try and focus on, let's say, especially on the first part of your presentation where you provided a framework for your work. And I was wondering, when thinking about care and so doing research about it, whether you have considered the housing condition as, let's say, a variable for considering also how care can and shall be performed. Because let's say in my work about housing, I have the feeling that many times the housing condition is conflated with the class condition, but they're actually not the same thing. And there are also different conceptions of what's an acceptable standard of habitation or rental market, or different types of dwelling across different types of countries. But I think that the connection between the specificity of the housing condition and also being housing stable, as opposed to being precarious or deprived, has made a lot of difference during this pandemic. And it made it very visible, not only because, for instance, overcrowding would cause higher rates of infection as it intersected with class, race, and so on. We've seen that a lot in the US. But also because I think it matters a lot when we think about care, also about what my colleagues were trying to point out about, for instance, what can you do with childcare? Of course, it changes a lot if you have a studio flat, or if at least you have two different rooms where people can scatter. So yeah, mine was more of a comment and a questions about how, whether and how housing entered in this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We did actually ask in interviews about housing, because for anybody who knows anything about Vancouver or has ever visited Vancouver, it has become one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in. And it's a North American city, so it's also very spread out. It has a really kind of suburban geography with quite poor public transport. And one of the things that workers commented on, and that particularly impacts workers who travel to people's homes to provide care, those spatial relations really impact people's working conditions. But it's also really true that the cost of housing is one of the things that made the wage, the devaluation of labor, so difficult and challenging, because this happened at the same time that housing prices were rising. Vancouver also has a really tight rental market. There's very little vacancy, very little availability of stable rental housing. Canada, like the US, is a country that has really committed to a home ownership model that also excludes a lot of people and excludes ever more as house prices go up. So I really agree with you that I think housing is both an important variable, but there's also a relationship between sort of housing as a kind of social infrastructure, or potentially a social infrastructure, and care labor. It's also, and this is the last thing I'll say, is it's also true that I think there has been and will be a renewed debate about keeping people in their own homes for as long as possible, but the limitations to doing that given the highly unequal conditions of housing. So, you know, if you're middle class or above and you own your own home and you have equity, you can usually afford to make accommodations so that you can stay in your home. But if you live in really poor quality rental housing, and you know, you have an elevator that doesn't work, or you have stairs that you have to use, you know, there are real barriers to people being that mean that people go into residential care before they might have to. So I think there is a renewed discussion and debate around this in the context of the need for more non-market housing. This is a big issue. We also have a huge issue with unhoused people. So people who do not have access to shelter, who live outside in parks and on the street. But it's going to take money, and the governments since the late 1990s have been really unwilling to invest in public housing in Canada, like in many other places.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Margherita. And if there are no other questions, I would go myself for some comments and questions. And first of all, thank you for, again, the very interesting presentation, but also for your suggestions about our US-Italy survey, because the issue there is just that there are so many invisible, subtle aspects of this question, this issue that need to be uncovered, that yes, we are kind of unsure sometimes of covering all the issues through a survey, which is probably, since that with secondary data, this kind of issue can be grasped, probably the collection of primary data is the way to go. Second, I had actually the same curiosity raised by Sarah. So the reaction, people's and workers' reaction to this ongoing situation, because the question here is also to understand to what extent these dynamics become in a way established or structural beyond the emergency phase. So probably the people's and workers' reactions in this sense is a relevant aspect, a salient aspect of the issue. And I would like to know your opinion or the idea you have on this, how long this, to what extent these dynamics will become in a way structural, also related to this care economy. And third question, more related probably to the first part of your presentation, about social reproduction. I see some more, let's say, explicit connections, but I would like to know from you, what is the specific form that social reproduction takes because of COVID, and differently from other, for instance, economic crisis we had? I mean, I don't know if I made me clear. I mean, are there any specific channels or forms that social reproduction takes during this shock that are different from other shocks, or peculiar in a way to this shock? Thank you.
Yeah, those are excellent questions. And I can connect with you over email, but if it would be interesting to you, I can share the survey that we did on impacts of COVID at SFU. Yeah, it was developed by a team. Anyways, it might just be interesting for you to see the questions that we ended up asking. So I might answer the last question first. I think that some of the impacts on social reproduction. So I guess the first thing to say is that I think what continues to be useful about the framework of social reproduction is it insists or foregrounds the connection between paid and unpaid work. And so the idea is really to ensure that our frameworks analyze them as interrelated rather than in a silo where we see paid work as something that happens in the public sphere and unpaid work as something that happens in the home. And sure, they have a relationship with each other, but one is economic and one is social, and in some ways I think COVID has made those connections even more explicit. We have the collapse, in a sense, at least for many of us, not for all, of the distinction between public and private. And what it also, I think, highlights in relation to things like the sort of crisis of the provision of care, childcare, for example, but also seniors care. So where people, mostly women, but not only women, are having to juggle in the same space their paid work and their unpaid work. And also, of course, these are spaces where there is violence. The domestic violence has really skyrocketed with people being stuck in these same spaces. And so those relations and contradictions of social reproduction and the contradictions inherent in the wage relation and the way that social reproduction supports the wage relation have kind of been rendered visible in a way that they maybe weren't before, even though many of us, know that they exist. And I think what's interesting is that it has forced policymakers in some contexts to at least acknowledge those crises and contradictions and their disproportionate impacts on women. But it's also amazing how, even though the governments can bring, wage supports, put wage supports in place, and as we said, we're saying at the very beginning, before the seminar, they can put a ban on firing people, they can intervene in all kinds of ways, but they don't, for example, suddenly, commit to the resources to public comprehensive childcare for everybody who needs it. For infants as well as for older children. It also, I think, highlights the salience of those early, very activist critiques of social reproduction that showed that social reproduction is essential to the reproduction of capital and capitalism, and yet it will only be supported insofar as it's necessary for that reproduction. And we sort of see that playing out. I'm personally very concerned about the politics of austerity that is going to follow the pandemic. So we've seen governments propping up wages and propping up jobs, and we're already in Canada seeing the forces mustering for cuts. We're going to have this huge deficit. We have to make cuts. And we know where cuts are going to happen. they're going to happen in the sphere of the social again. So, in that sense, I think there have been ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified, is maybe the word I would use, relations of social reproduction, in particular in the household. And they're maybe not new, but they're different. They're different configurations. And what the eventual politics of that is going to be, I think we still don't know. We've got the strength of kind of different forces that are sort of emerging, and there's going to be a lot of contestation, I think, going forward. And that relates to your question about the structural elements of the crisis. I mean, I think what's interesting and what I see in BC is that there are elements of the care crisis that policymakers and the public are invested in addressing. But so higher wages is one. I think everybody now understands that you can't pay workers in this sector extremely low wages and have them working multiple jobs to make ends meet and have quality care. You just can't. And yet there's very little willingness to address the underlying model. There's also very little willingness to address the reliance on migrant and immigrant workers in this sector. Nobody really wants to talk about that. And I think that that's true in other places as well. I'd be interested to know what the situation is in Italy, but from what I've read, you know, this is also a sector that is very feminized, but also, you know, very reliant on migrant and immigrant workers. And those structural social relations are not being talked about in Canada, at least, other than in some contexts, the need to bring more migrant workers in to do the work, you know, as if that's the solution to poor quality, you know, poor working conditions and low wages. So, Julia, what do you think are those kind of structural implications of COVID? I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Actually, I was mainly interested in the structural conditions connected to this new restructuring of the care economy, of the care sector, meaning these huge companies being within the economy and probably sort out all the other ones. And this has huge implications also in terms of access to healthcare. Right, so I think this is not the case in Italy, for instance. But I was wondering how to what extent you see this situation become potentially structural in.
Right. Sorry, I understand now. Yeah, that is something that that I would say is already structurally entrenched. So, and this was an explicit goal of the last government. They really wanted to open this sector up to private capital. And initially it was local capital. So what happened, just as a little sort of anecdote, when they started contracting out services for seniors care, for example, there was a local company in BC that was a very large donor to the Liberal Party that came into power. And of course, surprise, surprise, they ended up getting a lot of these contracts. They were then bought by Anbang Insurance, which is a huge Chinese insurance company that was recently taken over by the Chinese state because the head of the company was charged with corruption and fraud. And this is an insurance company that also has really extensive real estate holdings. And so one of the things I talk briefly about in the paper that really aligns with some of the structural conditions in the UK is that the assetization of property has been a driver in this sector and is, I think, now a structural feature of this sector, in part because property values are so high in BC. So it makes seniors care companies attractive to foreign investors, including financial companies, because their underlying property assets can be assetized and they're often then sold off and leased back. And, you know, there are a variety of mechanisms through which financialization then occurs. And so I think it's safe to say that this is already a structural element of the case, not to the extent that it is in the US, but it is present and it's going to be very difficult to reverse.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you also because with this last answer, you tackled the issue of ascetization that you had the time to really go through during your presentation. So thank you also for these thorough answers, which added a lot also to your very interesting presentation. There are no any other questions. We really took the most from you. We used all our time slot for this seminar. So thank you again for being here, and thank you for contributing to our GSSI webinar series.
Thank you so much. And those were wonderful questions. So I really enjoyed speaking to you all today, and you know, hopefully at some point, sometime, we will maybe see each other in person.
Yeah, we hope so.
Hopefully.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Kendra.
Goodbye,
Bye,
thank
everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Kendra. Bye.
Thank you, Kendra, for your presentation and question and answer session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.